If we're looking at the impacts of climate change, the climate models tell us that the signals of climate change are already visible in a number of places across the world. Large parts of Asia, southern Europe, large parts of Africa. Those are the places that are most likely to see the extreme impacts. They are the places where the trends are already visible. I've said before here that the United States is mostly not one of those places. Now, there may be signs of emerging trends detectable in a number of measures, but these are not as pronounced as in those other places. They are not predicted to be. Of course, that's exactly why some people who want to take you for a fool will tell you that the United States is the only data that you should look at, and even then only very carefully selected measures. But even outside of the blatant manipulators, there are examples of data being used that apparently supports the story that people want to tell, rather than the data being seen in the round, in the context of all the information we have, without trying to impose a set story onto it. In this video, I want to talk about this graph, showing the numbers of billion-dollar disasters in the United States and how some people are suggesting it shows the dramatic impact of climate change, whereas in fact what it shows is something quite different. Let me begin first with an acknowledgement. This video is inspired by and largely draws upon an extremely good article on the subject by Harry Stevens in the Washington Post. So, the graph produced by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. It shows disasters that have crossed the threshold for economic damage of $1 billion as measured by reported insurance claims, and categorises them into severe storms, hurricanes, inland floods, droughts, winter storms, wildfires and crop freezes. As you can see at a glance, severe storms and hurricanes are really consistently the big-ticket items. And at first glance, you would certainly think this graph supports the argument of people who tell you that the United States, contrary to what I said at the start of this video, is clearly already feeling the impacts of climate change and it's costing big time. The Biden administration implies exactly that argument when it said climate change is a major driver of the increased frequency, duration and severity of extreme weather and climate-related disasters. Millions of Americans feel the effects of these extreme events when their roads and schools flood and hospitals lose power. Over the past few years, the frequency of extreme weather and climate-related disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion has skyrocketed. Now, in a court of law, I expect the administration could argue it doesn't explicitly state causation, but it's certainly implied, in which case the prosecution would then point to another statement by the same administration that is more explicit, where they say this: one of the most direct ways that Americans experience climate change is through increases in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. So far this year, the United States has already experienced 25 weather and climate disasters that each resulted in more than $1 billion of damages. And of course, the references to the same data set. The Federal Reserve also goes the whole hog, referencing the dataset like this. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, reports that climate change is increasing the frequency of extreme conditions that lead to disasters such as droughts, hurricanes, flooding and wildfires. That, of course, is not correct. That data source does not reference climate change, it only references extreme conditions that cause a set amount of financial damage. You might intuitively think that would be the same thing, but it is not the same thing. The US Fifth National Climate Assessment referenced the same data under the heading "Climate change is not just a problem for future generations, it's a problem today." In the text, it hedges its bets a little more than the other government departments quoted so far managed. It said this: "The number and cost of weather-related disasters have increased dramatically over the past 4 decades, in part due to the increasing frequency and severity of extreme events, and in part due to increases in exposure and vulnerability." Now, maybe it's true that climate change is driving increasing frequency and severity. We'll come to that later. But the point is that the data source they're referencing doesn't back it up. D. James Baker, the former head of NOAA through 1993 to 2001, talking about the billion-dollar dataset, said that it is quoted a lot, and people use it as a way of saying that climate change is already influencing what we see, and yet unless you get the economics right, you can't really justify that. This was reinforced by Lawrence Bauer, a climate risk assessment expert, and, by the way, a lead author on 5 IPCC reports. We know that climate change is real. We don't see it in the economic losses yet. How did this dataset even get started, you might wonder? Well, it came sometime in the early 1990s when Neil Lott and Tom Ross started tracking weather disasters in the US that caused at least $1 billion in economic losses. They reviewed government reports, they phoned insurance companies to compile that list. Pretty much a side project. Neil Lott said, at that point, it was not an attempt to do any sort of a scientific study. As far as climate change, that wasn't in mind at all. When each year brought a longer list of disasters, it didn't occur to the 2 meteorologists that it was because the weather had changed. Instead, they identified that there were more people and property in areas prone to natural hazards. Now, this is not, of course, a phenomenon unique to the United States. Look across the world, find the areas prone to earthquakes and volcanoes, and there you will find thriving human cities and other habitations. We are, as a species, collectively pretty stupid when it comes to casually putting ourselves in harm's way. Take, for instance, Hurricane Opal, which hit the Florida Panhandle in 1995. That didn't go well. In the assessment afterwards as to what had gone wrong, it was noted that evacuation plans had been developed based on figures from the 1980 census, but population growth of 24%, housing growth of 42% had already rendered those plans massively obsolete, which had led to residents being trapped on packed highways that had simply gummed up. Not that that stopped Americans thinking that moving to Florida might not be a fab thing to do. The combined population of the 15 counties trashed by the recent Hurricane Milton was just 3.7 million back in 1980, but it had swelled to 9.1 million in time for the storm. During the same period, the economic activity in that area, reflecting the wealth of population, quadrupled. Tom Ross, the other creator of the dataset, noted this: "It doesn't take as much to get to $1 billion now as it did 20 years ago. If a storm hiccups, it gets $1 billion worth of damage now. 20 years ago, it took a lot more than a hiccup to do it." Did that mean that climate change has nothing to do with it? Lott and Ross will not suggest they have the information to say one way or the other, because it's not what the dataset measures. It's a complex proposition to disentangle how much of the increase is due to climate change, how much of it is due to risky development in disaster-prone areas. I think you have to be careful rushing to judgments one way or the other on it, Ross said. But you might say rushing to judgments is our favourite hobby in all the world, as evidenced by 1 million angry tweets every day. But let's not get distracted. Just because that dataset isn't created to identify climate influence doesn't mean that some analysis to untangle the different influences couldn't be carried out. The study by Weinkel et al. 2018 looked at hurricane damage specifically, rather than all climate-related disasters, and it showed one set of figures that was adjusted for inflation, which showed a clear increase over time, but then another graph that was adjusted for inflation and population growth and wealth, and that showed no overall trend. One of the authors of that paper, Roger Pielke Jr., said the degree of societal change dwarfs expected climate changes by orders of magnitude. That's not to say climate change isn't important. It's just to say that we humans are really transforming the surface of the Earth in really profound ways. Here's another set of graphs showing the different factors from that study influencing the cost of damage, the number of hurricanes and the number of major hurricanes making landfall. These are not predicted to increase with climate change, although the severity of some of the storms is expected to increase. And then population in coastal counties and wealth in coastal counties, both of which are pretty unambiguous. The thing is that since the signs of climate change are emerging in the United States, not highly developed, looking to blunt data sets based on $1 billion of damage or similar, those are not the places where you would expect to first see the fingerprints of change. It would be in studies like this one, Kirchmeier, Young and Zhang 2020, that found that extreme precipitation in the US has increased in recent years, which is attributed to human-caused climate change. Such extreme precipitation causes damage, of course. Doesn't necessarily emerge into a database of billion-dollar disaster events. By the way, note that the graphs shown here show the early trend, but most of those graphs are projections into the future. It's worth noting, in addition, that insurance companies, who are becoming increasingly unwilling to insure properties in risk zones, are going on more nuanced data than the crude billion-dollar disaster measure, and have stated publicly that they see climate trends as well as population and wealth trends as one of the risks they have to actively manage for. Other scientists are pointing out that if we get hurricanes like the recent Hurricane Helene, which attribution studies have suggested was made 10% more severe due to human-caused climate change, which is certainly possible, that added 10% severity must be translatable into additional economic damage. Now, intuitively, you'd say, sure, but across the whole damaged area, it strikes me as a tricky operation to say that tower, that bridge, that building would not have collapsed if the storm had been 10% less severe. NASA scientist Kate Marvel made the case. We know that climate change did have something to do with the increase in risk of particular extreme events, not all extreme events, but certain extreme events. I think then the burden might be to demonstrate that detected climate influence therefore has no effect whatsoever on the associated costs. It's a fair point, but not an argument for the widespread use of a dataset and a graph to illustrate something that it patently does not illustrate. Roger Pielke Jr. has been the highest profile critic of how the NOAA billion-dollar disaster database has been used in practice. Early this year, he sent NOAA a request for a correction, charging it with having fallen short of integrity standards by failing to disclose how it arrived at its estimates for each billion-dollar disaster, or indeed to submit the dataset for peer review. In response, NOAA acknowledged that the dataset is overdue for peer review, although it added it couldn't always share private data provided by insurance companies. But still, it is being used by campaigners and by politicians to prove something that it really doesn't prove. When it comes to public policy, what we should really be learning from all of this is that societies that have built up in harm's way should at least be prepared for the worst. Take Hurricane Katrina, for example. From the best research we have, we can conclude that Katrina probably was made somewhat stronger than it would have been by the impact of climate change. But is that actually the point we should be focusing on the most? Katrina made landfall as a Category 3 hurricane, and it was devastating and caused huge damage and loss of life. But as Ilan Kelman, Professor of Disasters and Health at University College London, said, New Orleans should have been prepared for a Category 5. and it was engineering flaws in the city's protective levees that resulted in flooding that submerged 80% of the city. State governments and their equivalents all over the world, they tend to put off adaptations, flood defences and so on. At least until after the first time it really goes horribly wrong. Identifying trends that will worsen with climate change are arguably only of value if you're then going to act on the knowledge, which, yes, means spending money, in spite of those people bleating on about tax dollars being spent. Generally, this is a hard discussion to have. Many of the people making the case against the NOAA dataset, such as Pielke Jr., spent a lot of time pointing out that none of this means that climate change isn't real and serious, and they take the time to do that because too often the discussion is shaped by one side or the other, in this case arguably both, looking to seize on a shade of grey and argue that it's either black or it's white. However, just because there are children in the room doesn't mean we can't and shouldn't have an adult conversation. Kudos to Harry Stevens, who got this article into the Washington Post. To be fair, not always where you expect to find shades of grey, to be honest, but in doing so, helped to promote sensible discussion in an important area.